So good evening, everyone. I'm Patricia Taylor. I'm a solicitor with DWF and I'm the Secretary of the Scottish Young Lawyers Association. Our non-executive committee member, Amina Amin, was originally meant to introduce this evening's event, and Amina has prepared the following introduction, which I'll present on her behalf. Before we get started, can I ask that for the first portion of the event, you keep your cameras off and your microphones on mute so that only the speakers have their cameras and microphones on. You may also wish to select speaker view for your screen, meaning that you can see our speakers more clearly. The session today is to be recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. So firstly, we will undertake a panel discussion, which will run for approximately 45 minutes. Following this, there will be an opportunity to pose questions to our panellists via the Q&A function or the chat box function, and we'll get to these at the end. But should you have a question that arises and you want to post it as we're going through the panel Q&A discussion, please do post this in the chat box as well. So on behalf of the Scottish Young Lawyers Association, welcome and thank you so much for joining us for our second roundtable focusing on diversity and inclusion within the Scottish legal profession. Tonight we'll be lending our focus to progress within the profession. And our six panellists are expertly placed to speak to this topic, as is our chair, Usman Tariq, who we are delighted to have with us today. Usman is the co-founder of the Scottish Ethnic Minority Lawyers Association, or SEMLA, which aims to improve ethnic diversity within the legal profession in Scotland. He's also an advocate at the Scottish Bar and a member of Ampersand Advocates. So without further ado, I'll now pass on to you, Usman. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. This is the second part of the discussion that we're having about race and ethnicity in the legal profession in Scotland. In the first part of the discussion, we looked at issues around access to the profession, and in particular, what are the issues facing ethnic minority students who are trying to access the profession, and how do we address those issues? We're now moving on to progress in the profession. We want to look at what issues hold back ethnic minority lawyers from progressing in the profession, and how do we resolve those issues? This is all vitally important. We all want a legal profession where people progress because of their own abilities, their own character, and their own hard work, and not because of their gender, the colour of their skin, their religion, their socioeconomic background, and so on. I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel of speakers today who all come from a variety of different backgrounds and bring different perspectives and insights to the discussion. What I would propose to do is to introduce the panelists and then start with some questions to the panel. I would encourage each of you to type any questions that you have into the chat function, and I will try and take those questions if and when they arise, if they fit into the natural flow of conversation. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panel. And if I introduce you, could you just wave or say hello? So first of all, I want to introduce Emmi Makiharju. She is the Inclusion and Diversity and Belonging Manager at Ashurst. Emmi, do you want to wave?
Hello.
Hi. And next we have Tutora Makushi. Tutora is a solicitor and is convener of the Law Society of Scotland's Racial Inclusion Group. Thanks, Tutora. Next, we have Elaine McGlone. Elaine is the Equality and Diversity Manager at the Law Society of Scotland.
Hello.
Next, we have Emma Smith. Emma is the Inclusion and Wellbeing Manager at Burness Paul.
Hello.
And finally, we have Brynella Scott. Brynella is a solicitor at Harper MacLeod. She is a member of the Law Society of Scotland's Racial Inclusion Group, and she is also a committee member of the SYLA. Do you want to say hello, Brynella?
Hi.
And we will hopefully be joined by Professor Maria Fletcher, who I think is running a little bit late. Just by way of introduction, Maria is the Professor in European Law, Deputy Head and an Employability Officer at Glasgow Law School. And when you see her, you won't believe this, but she was my lecturer at university, albeit I think she looks younger than me. So that's just something to notice when she appears on screen. So if I could ask all of our panelists to unmute themselves. And I'm going to open up with a question, which is quite a stark question. It is there systematic discrimination against ethnic minorities in the legal profession in Scotland? Is there systematic discrimination against ethnic minority lawyers in the legal profession in Scotland? Who wants to come in from the panel on that question first?
I am happy to go first.
Yes.
On that, yeah, I would say yes. I would say that, you know, there are subtle ways in which our biases and stereotypes about other groups manifest in our firm's policies or systems or norms that we have within our law firms. And I do believe that these biases and stereotypes are putting up obstacles or barriers in the way of progression of members of an equity deserving group. So, you know, minority, people from a minority ethnic background or people from marginalized backgrounds. So I would have to say that that is a yes.
Does anybody else from the panel want to come in?
I mean, I would certainly agree to an extent, but I think it is a difficult one, isn't it? Because I think I wouldn't be able to pinpoint sort of one specific thing that is causing discrimination or kind of adverse impact to promotion, for example. And I in a way, I kind of hope I could, because then I could easily kind of remove it and make sure that we progressed. But I think it is exactly the point around those subtle behaviors, those biases that are in place, and in a way that's it's almost kind of a harder challenge to kind of attack as well, which is yeah, difficult.
Yes, Tutura?
Yes, I think the answer is yes. And it's important to note that it's not malicious. We're not talking about malicious discrimination. We're not talking about deliberate discrimination. We're talking about the fact that the outcomes are worse, that there isn't the diversity that we'll expect to see. And we can trace that back through people's careers, their education, to certain things that either deterred them from entering the profession, made it more difficult at certain stages, or got them left behind their peers. For example, take Professor Leslie Thomas QC. There's a big name for you. Despite the fact that he's a professor and a QC, he's the one to say he would have been a QC before his peers, or at least before others, before he did become one, but for the fact of the color of his skin, and that's discrimination that he's experienced and lived to tell, and still managed to reach where he is. But you think about the cost of that and how many other people will be suffering from the same thing who didn't make it to where he is. That's what we're talking about systemic discrimination. There are things like finances, socioeconomic circumstances, things that tally with with the big ethnic minority. These are obstacles, these are hurdles that, unless you actually deliberately look for them and browse them out, will always remain there, which is what makes them systematic and means they'll always persist unless you deliberately go for them.
I think we're now joined by Maria as well. Maria, if feel free to join the conversation. I appreciate you're on mute at the moment with your camera off, but once you get the chance, feel free. Oh, hello. Hi, Maria. We can see you.
Hi, Usman. Thank you for that. I just came in as you was describing me as looking younger than you, so that was nice. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me. And sorry I was late. I'm going to let others take the lead in the discussion on the basis that I'm slightly outside, sitting in academia. I'd love to come in later to have a kind of to speak and share my thoughts, in particular from the perspective of legal education, which is obviously a pathway into the profession. So thanks again for inviting me, and I'll certainly come in as the conversation continues. Thanks, Usman.
Thanks, Maria. Does anybody else want to come in on that question on systematic discrimination in the profession, or can we move on? I think I'll move on to the next question. And once again, I will say that if anybody is watching and you have a question, just feel free to type it into the chat box and I will pick it up when I see it. So do you think that lawyers from an ethnic minority background progress slower in the legal profession than other lawyers? And if so, why is that? Who wants to come in on that question?
Happy to start, conscious I've already
Yes.
spoken, so I don't want to sort of take over the conversation. So now we've done a bit of data analysis around this at Ashurst, and we've not been able to specifically see it in the data that we have. But I would just say that's not to say that it doesn't exist. And I think, you know, we always need to look at how accurate our data is. We will never have 100% of data, so we need to take it with a pinch of salt. But I do think, you know, anecdotally, yes, we hear that, and I can see it as well, and certainly something that our colleagues and specifically in our networks around multiculturalism do speak about. I think some of the reasons, and I'd be very keen to hear other reasons from other people as well, but it's around kind of the lack of mentorship or sponsorship. If you don't identify someone within your organization, or even someone in a kind of a similar organization who can maybe provide a bit of guidance, some support, a bit of reassurance, you know, I think that will make it more challenging. And actually, sometimes you need that push to be assertive and kind of seek out some opportunities. So I think just kind of seeing, if you're not seeing anyone who's kind of leading the way, and seeing someone who looks like you or has your similar experiences and backgrounds, and of course that can make it a lot more challenging. So those are some of the things that I've heard.
Who wants to go in, answer next?
Sorry, firstly, I'm having an absolute nightmare with my connection, so I've been in and out and missed most of the first question. I would just probably say that I echo what Emmi said. I, from experience at Burness Paul, haven't seen that particularly happening, but I think the feedback, and that's probably because we're not, you know, we don't have a huge number of minority ethnic lawyers, and so we don't have that experience of that. But I don't, you know, I haven't seen any particular metrics around that, whether it be from kind of the Law Society or coming, you know, of our own experience. But I think echoing what Emmi would say, yeah, there is probably a lack of support structures in place, and that I can see that where that could be the case, certainly, and having in place things like mentorship schemes and having that sort of support network and would make a difference, I would hope. But obviously very keen to hear what people who have actually got experience of that would say.
Ryanella, were you wanting to come in?
Yes, I was just going to agree with Emmi's point about mentorship as well. I do think that having a mentor there and being able to see that there is, you know, room for progression does help. I know at the moment at Harper McLeod, we do have the most partners from an ethnic minority background, and that is when compared to other law firms in Scotland. And it's definitely quite positive to see that in relation to see, you know, what is my career trajectory, and I do think that a way of assisting this, if there is, you know, if it is slower, is definitely making sure that everyone has equal access to the same opportunities, you know, that their progression, you know, will be taken seriously. Otherwise it will slow down, or you just won't see it because they will leave and it will become a revolving door.
One of the questions that has come in just on this topic from Gillian Carsey is it about building career confidence, or is there more required in terms of mentorship and sponsorship? Who wants to come in on that question? Sorry to pick on you, Tora. I know we've spoken in the past about mentorship and also just about kind of building career confidence. Do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, you got me there. Obviously, we have discussed this in the racial inclusion group, and amongst lots of other things, and it is very much about being, amongst other things, it's quite difficult. I mean, it's not difficult. It's when you take these questions, you take them together. So if you take this question and the one before, they're quite similar in terms of the factors that sort of inform and the way the environment is constructed. If you are if you're a Black or the minority lawyer and you come into the profession, you're likely to be the only one, or one of very, very few, even visible in your cohort anywhere near. And you also like to be something of a pioneer, because there haven't been many Black lawyers or minority lawyers in Scotland, certainly. And if you look at people at partnership level, or sort of in the very senior positions, even in the faculty, the visual is very clear. They just don't exist. The history isn't there. So when you're looking for relatable figures and for people who can show you the way, or people who can be the way for you to follow, they just aren't there in the way that they are for other people. And this isn't, for want of a better simile, a black and white thing. There is a vast array of factors, socioeconomic factors that play into the same thing. And if you don't find yourself, able to access people because of your own wealth or lack thereof, because of, you're not in the same social settings as people who are in senior positions, then you're not going to make those connections. You're not going to be part of the conversation. You're not even going to speak the same language that the people at the top are speaking, that the people you want to be close to are speaking. And then relating just circumstances, relating yourself, your own circumstances, your business circumstances, those things are just that bit more difficult. They're things you just can't take for granted when you're from a minority background, and you have to work that much harder at. That was very handy. We have people from law firms here, because they're the ones who hold the data, and it's incredibly useful. And I'm really grateful they are doing number crunching, because that is what's going to tell us sort of across time, across years, what is actually happening. And I'm sure they just said, things like mentoring programs, sponsorship structures, they probably wouldn't have those in place because they've never needed them. You wouldn't put these things into place unless you needed them, unless you had someone who'd either asked for them or even noticed that they weren't there. And we're talking about a very, very, very small minority of lawyers who are from Black minority ethnic background. So you can't really blame the law firms for not having had these things in place. Obviously, they're aware of them, and we've heard from lots of law firms that they are doing exactly this sort of thing: mentoring, reverse mentoring, sponsorship, those sorts of things. And I hope that the outcome is positive, because that's what's been shown to be positive in other jurisdictions.
And I think simply just in terms of my own experiences, often it's not the formal mentoring that's important. It's the kind of the informal mentoring that happens in the background. The allyship from someone that's more senior in the firm, that's there to support you, that's there to help you. For instance, my own example, when I was a trainee solicitor at one of the big commercial law firms, the person I looked up to and who helped me was not from the same ethnic background as me, but we had a connection, and he was a great assistance to my career. Likewise, when I joined the bar, there weren't a huge amount of role models there that I could go to that looked like me from my background. But again, the people that I looked up to who helped me along were from a different ethnic background. But it's just being able to make those connections, which I think, Tatora, you've just touched upon. It's the need to make those, there's a bit more of an emphasis if you come from an ethnic minority background to need to make those connections so that you start to learn more about how you progress, get the insights that are required. There's been, William has posted in the chat some interesting data. I'm just going to pick that up at this stage whilst we're talking about systematic discrimination and progress. He says the data shows categorically that there is systematic discrimination. 17.5% of UK lawyers are BAME, only 8% of partners in big law. Additionally, there are more female lawyers than male in the UK, yet 2/3 of UK partners are male. And William talks about the data across the UK. I think it's a fairly similar picture in Scotland, albeit the numbers are smaller, that it's a smaller percentage of lawyers from a BAME background and an even smaller percentage who are partners. He then says attrition rates are higher in BAME lawyers than white and BAME associates, work on 22 to 33% fewer matters per year, and spend an average of 20% less time in their posts than their non-BAME counterparts. And you will have seen some of that data that's come out, particularly in London, around Black lawyers and the fact that they tend to stay in firms for a shorter period of time than the white counterparts. Does anybody want to come in on that data, or is there, or is anybody able to talk about what's understood to be the position in Scotland? Yes, Elaine.
Hi, I can certainly say that I think the situation for male-female partners, it is about 2/3 male, 1/3 female in Scotland. It's sort of hovering around 33-35% of female partners are female. We do have some data which has been published. It's from 2018, which is, you know, getting a little bit out of date now, and it may be that the Racial Inclusion Group report will have more up-to-date data, but so maybe Satora could comment on that. But certainly in 2018, the information we had from our Profile of Profession report was that a greater proportion of white, Scottish or British respondents earned over £60,000 when compared to white, other and other ethnic groups. So that's a fairly obvious situation where you can see that just looking at pay rather than a person's perception, that overall that BAME solicitors were not getting to those higher paying roles in the same sort of proportion as white solicitors are. So I think that's quite telling, because it is simply based on what their the pay they were reporting, rather than you know, a perception. So that, I think that's quite interesting. As I say, I think probably once the Racial Inclusion Group report comes out, it's not quite ready to be published there. I think that might have more up-to-date information. That's certainly something to look out for.
Sorry, did you put your hand up?
I just to clarify what Elaine said, because I've been name jacked.
Sorry.
No, we were hoping to have an autumn sort of outing of the report, and I think autumn is probably gone now. I think we're probably firmly into winter, but hopefully we should have in time for your stocking fillers. The report's completed. Thank God for that. As Wynne and Brian will say, it's been a long time coming. There's a lot of qualitative data, a lot of quantitative data, and it's mixing those two, you know, getting those things right, making sure the report reads right is the sort of the final bit, the final furlong that we're on just now. So it'll all be out, and we'll have more up-to-date data than, I guess, 2018. Although looking at the 2018 data, and looking at data that's been collected sort of before then and since then, those trends are really important to note, to see what has been happening over time. Obviously, the past couple of years is going to be somewhat anomalous in terms of everything that sort of shows up. But at the same time, it will tell us some things about what has changed, what has been tried or done over the past sort of year and a half, and what's worked. Yeah, no spoilers, but the report is on its way.
We have spoken about the importance of things such as mentorship, and I touched upon allyship just in terms of being able to progress in your career if you're an ethnic minority lawyer. What are there other factors that impede the progress of lawyers from ethnic minority backgrounds into senior positions in law firms and organizations? Who wants to come in on that?
I think, and what's been mentioned by William in the chat as well around the data, and actually I can't really unfortunately speak to the Scottish data, so a lot of the data sets that we have they're more UK wide or sort of city law firm data. But I think, you know, William's absolutely right. The attrition specifically around ethnically diverse lawyers and specifically Black lawyers is so much higher than it is with their sort of white peers. And I think, you know, what we've seen, and so we've recently done some reporting with Race Fairness Commitment, which is part of RARE, which is diversity consultancy, and they've just announced some of that data, or some of those reporting. And you know, what we're seeing is specifically after qualification, it almost sort of peaks within then. So we're losing really talented people. You know, they've qualified, they've stayed with the firm up until that point, and then for whatever reasons they leave. And of course, that's going to be hugely sort of have a negative impact on our pipeline as well. And that's something that we really need to pinpoint as to what it is that's making, you know, Ashurst or whatever. I think it's kind of cross-wide, different organizations having similar issues. What is it that we're not doing, or something that we should really kind of focus on to ensure that we are, you know, people do want to stay and have their career with us, and then do kind of progress into more senior roles as well. But you know, unfortunately, don't quite have an answer for that. But I think the attrition piece and generally retention is hugely challenging.
Any other thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I would like to jump in. When it comes to, you know, what can impede the progress, I would definitely say a lack of analysis of what your embedded practices and systems that you have within law firms, you know, it can lead to impeding progression. We need to look at the way that we recruit, you know, retain and promote lawyers from an ethnic minority background. We need to look at the way in which we promote promotions. So, for example, there might be a lack of understanding of different cultures. So, for example, if you're going to be going golfing, or if you're going to be having lots of events that are at nighttime where that involves alcohol, you know, some people from an ethnic minority background that have cultural sort of sorry, I've got a bit of a cough. Some people from an ethnic minority background might not feel comfortable being in those situations. You know, golfing is predominantly middle class. They might not know how to golf. They might feel like they might not be in a position to feel comfortable doing that. Although, you know, the people that do that may be the ones that then progress because they're with the in crowd, or because they feel as though I would say that people that do the promoting feel as though they have more things in similar, you know, in with those people. So I feel like just assessing the way in which you promote, assessing the culture of the firm, assessing your practices will definitely be able to help you ensure that there is, you know, equity when it comes to promoting people.
Does anybody else want to come in on that question? Tutora, yes?
I would, oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Elaine, please go ahead. No? Okay. Oh, Maria, please. Yeah.
Perhaps I can come in, because this is really fascinating, because I think I think all of this also applies at the university level, and I think we need to do better at assessing our own systems and practices and thinking about where they do have an exclusionary impact or an inequitable impact. And it's been really interesting even in the last kind of 6 months, there's been a much more kind of engaged and interested debate that is sometimes just called decolonizing the curriculum. It's actually, and it's not just about changing reading lists. It's much more deeply embedded and much more kind of, yeah, much more than that. So it's much more about looking more widely at cultures and practices. But I think it's very, very genuine endeavor, and a significant amount of kind of thinking and work and conversations are being had around that. And I think that's really, really positive. And just linking back to data also in the universities, I think we've been quite poor at collecting data around students of colour and ethnic minority students. So we've made, I can only speak for Glasgow University, but we've made really, really great strides in terms of widening participation and looking particularly at socioeconomic background. But I think less good at kind of understanding intersectionality and thinking about data and collecting data and looking at it carefully around ethnic minorities. And we are certainly in conversation with our number crunchers in the university, and are going to hopefully be able to get much more kind of detailed and granular data that we really want to be using in the coming years. And so I think this is progress, but it's a work in progress. But it's really great to be connected into the profession, because obviously we are the pipeline into the profession, and so we've got to do much better so that the profession can do better.
I think it's also just progress in that we're having these conversations, because these conversations were not taking place in the legal profession in Scotland, even going back maybe 2 or 3 years ago. We just didn't have candid conversations about what we were doing wrong and what we should be doing more. So that in itself is progress. There's an interesting point that William has put in the chat, which is regarding diversity. The Law Society say that differential opportunities for good work is one of the main reasons for a lack of diversity. And I think that would equally apply to promotion, because I think there's been, I think William in some of the other data he's referred to has touched upon the fact that those from ethnic minority backgrounds don't get the same access to good work and to good clients. And that in itself then is impacts on things such as billable hours if you're within a commercial law firm, and your client base, which are then quite important factors in promotion. And in fact, you may have even seen, I think in the US, large companies are now starting to insist upon the diversity breakdown of the lawyers that are working on their matters, that there has to be a certain percentage of female lawyers or certain percentage from minority groups. So that's some progress that we're seeing in the US. I'm going to move on to another. We've talked a little bit about the traditional networks that exist. I think there's been talk of golfing, for instance, but it's just more kind of generally the fact that so much of career progress happens in the shadows, away from the formal recruitment process, where you meet people, you get to build relationships, and those people are the ones in senior positions that then dictate whether you progress or not. I was going to move on to this next question, which is that the profession has sometimes been perceived as an old boys club. It was white men that held senior positions, and career development depended on being able to fit into that club. Does that perception still hold in the 21st century? And if so, how does that impact ethnic minority lawyers? Who wants to come in on that?
I think I could come in on that. From the information we have, the stereotypical Scottish solicitor would be an under 40s woman. It's not the old boy anymore, but simply because we've had such an influx of women coming into the profession. It's been like that ever since, well, I graduated in 1991, and my class was at least half female at that stage. For whatever reason, it's not been reflected in the partnerships. So the fact that the actual look of the profession is quite different to what the perception might be, that it's an old white men. I think it is. We've done quite a bit. Whether people still look at, I've done some work in relation to unconscious bias, and if you do just even a Google search of images of lawyers or images of secretaries, the lawyers do tend to, the Google search does tend to bring up images of white men. To be fair, if you Google secretary, you get a page of young women. So that's an all over cultural thing rather than just specifically to Scotland. That's bringing in lots of quite, probably a lot from America as well. So yeah, the actuality of the Scottish legal profession is quite different to the stereotypical image, I would say now. So I think we do need to do work to combat that idea that it's only a profession for, it's only a comfortable profession for white men. Yeah, there's certainly much to do.
I guess the thing would be that if you were if you had insights into the profession, or you had connections to the profession, you would know that it's more diverse than what the perceptions people have. But if you have no insight into the legal profession, say you're an ethnic minority law student or someone that's thinking of studying law, and you don't know any lawyers, then that perception still exists. And it is a barrier to thinking, actually, am I going to be able to fit in? What's the point of dedicating 4 years of a law degree and a diploma when this is the profession itself is an old boys club and I'm not going to fit in? Who wants to come in on that, Tutora?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Emma,
sorry, I was
come in first.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there probably is still that perception, and in part that is obviously reinforced by the fact you just need to kind of look on the majority of law firm websites and you look through the partnership, and that is what you see, and that's improved over time. I think on the point around, I think the point you were saying, Usman, on the sort of things that go on in the background, the sort of networking, BD, the golf trips, etc. I think the huge focus that there's been on sort of gender equality over the last few years in legal has perhaps diluted that slightly. I would hope that's the case. There has been, you know, we're seeing the dialogue that we're sort of having now on race and ethnicity is fairly new, but the dialogue on, you know, gender equality has been going on for quite a long time, and that certainly, I think, hopefully one of the benefits that's come out for all underrepresented groups in law firms is that there has been, at least in my experience, firms have really sort of taken notice of that, and the sort of, you know, evenings in the pub or the golf trips, that's really, it's not something that we see so much anymore for various reasons. And, you know, as I say, partly that's been pushed by the sort of the gender equality piece. But yeah, I would say that the whole perceptions are probably still out there, but I would hope diluted. And I probably think even more so over the last couple of years, some of those barriers have been diluted even further with the pandemic, and people have just found other ways to network and to build up those relationships, which are hopefully ways that are more accessible to everyone going forward.
Who wants to come in next on that question? Tutora?
Yes. The issue, well, the first issue is we're not just talking about one profession. We're talking about a profession that's really quite subdivided. Now, it's quite easy here to talk about the corporate side of law because it's fairly well represented. And also, when I was a young lawyer, not a young Scottish lawyer, but a young lawyer, I wanted to be a corporate lawyer because that was the most attractive prospect. But I didn't. I became a legal aid / law centre lawyer. And there's lots and lots of ethnic minority people in that area of law. There are lots of them at every level. There are loads of partners. If you look at the data, I'll show you there's a huge number of partners of law firms with an ethnic minority background, but they'll be predominantly working in areas like immigration and criminal justice, or, you know, the far less glamorous areas of the law. So to say the law is an old boys club, you know, if you look at the data, you could probably find that it's not anymore. But if you look at where the decision-making power lies, you will quite easily see that it's skewed towards a particular demographic. And it's, again, we're talking about systematic, you know, a system that's been there for a very long time, and we're working in sort of pieces of attrition to work against it. So we talk about the what some will call the feminization of the law. We have more, I think for the first year, we have more female lawyers coming in than we have male lawyers, and that seems to be the trend. But we have that attrition where by partner level, that just isn't the case anymore, and that continues, that trend continues. So the old boys element, there are systematic elements of the professions that are preserving that legacy of a certain type of demographic reaching the top, staying at the top, and maintaining that dominance. And like you said before, if you don't see yourself represented at the top, it's quite difficult to, for you to get there. There's no shoes for you to follow in. But the people at the top aren't pulling you up, then you're not going to get there. So if I'm looking for a mentor, I am going to have to look for someone from the Old Boys Network. I am going to have to learn how to play golf and that is a seriously big undertaking. Fortunately, whiskey, not so difficult, but I'm going to have to culturalize myself in certain ways to fit in, so I can join that club. These are the artifacts of that club. Unless they say I can become a partner tomorrow, and become do legal aid law. It's not every law centre lawyer who becomes First Minister of Scotland. Most of us don't. But there's definitely a line there where we talk about two different sides, two different professions.
I'm going to move on. We've spoken quite a bit about the issues. I'm going to think maybe ask some questions around solutions and what more we can do. One of the interesting comments that I always hear is that we need to look at the pipeline, and there isn't the ethnic minority lawyers within the pipeline that can reach, that are in that pipeline for promotion to senior positions such as partnership, senior associates, directors of law firms, etc. Is that accurate? And if it is, how do we try and improve the pipeline? Who wants to come in on that question?
Happy to start.
Yeah.
And I know I kind of briefly spoke about this already, but and again, referring to some more UK statistics, unfortunately, but some of the data that's recently come out is showing that industry-wide, specifically around Black lawyers, but also around ethnically diverse. I mean, in some of the sort of higher PQE levels, it could be the industry-wide single digits of people. So I mean, I think that's a huge issue, but that's not to say we should actually kind of leave it there and say, well, we can't fix it, so that's that's it done. I think we need to make sure that we're creating an organization where we're keeping the people we're coming in from early careers, so from our trainees, focusing on lateral hires. It's a hugely competitive market, but people are there. We know that people are, there's talented people out there, and again, we just need to create a really inclusive organization that attracts them. So I think there's lots that we can do there, and I think it's quite good to actually have a competitive market, because it forces us to constantly do better and do more, because we know that if we're not, another firm is going to kind of snap people up. So yeah, so I think things around, I don't think pay is necessarily the biggest draw anymore. I think for some people potentially, but I think it's really around kind of what are those career opportunities, what is, and we spoke about it before, about kind of access to interesting work, access to interesting clients, all of those things. And I think we need to be really proactive about showing that those are the opportunities if you do join the firm.
Who wants to go next? Tutora?
Yeah, I'll just speak to something that we discovered in the racial inclusion group, and that's that the pipeline starts long before legal recruitment. It starts in education. It starts with people, pretty much as young as you can get them, perceiving themselves as being able to, to achieve things in law, seeing themselves as fitting in the profession, and having the will and the means to get through. There are obviously things that happen along the way that quite often, speed bumps that people hit that knock them off. One of them, a big one, I think, is cost. The cost of getting into, getting through the profession is quite high, and it favors people who have wealthier parents or money from elsewhere, or just the luxury of being able to either take the money or take the time to get through the process. And that, unfortunately, is if you don't have the luxury of being able to do two weeks of unpaid work to get the work placement, or being able to get a tutor to help you with your studies, you just end up you end up with poorer grades, or you end up with what looks like a lack of experience, and then you just think, well, I'm not going to get there because everyone else has got the work placements. I didn't get it first, and then you end up sort of throwing yourself off out of the pipeline. Either that, or they just said you're up against quite a big stack of people who have amazing results or really good work placements, and then you just get left behind in the pipeline. And yeah, a lack of choice, you may drop out, you may move in house. You know, you just take different directions.
If I could ask, what could law firms do to try, and we've heard some of the issues around progress. What could law firms and other organizations do to try and level the playing field when it comes to things such as recruitment and promotion? Just level the playing field for all lawyers, so some of the disadvantages that we've spoken about perhaps can be eroded. Who wants to come in with some views on that?
I'll come in when it comes to that. It's just to reiterate what Tutor was saying. You know, having a traditional recruitment process of our summer placements, it can definitely exclude certain sections of society. So I think perhaps having a look at that and trying to find other ways of recruiting, because obviously that starts off with LLB students or diploma students, and that in itself can obviously kind of take away that option for a lot of minority or marginalized groups. I do think that it also doesn't help students that are in a low income background as well. Like Tutorish just said, you might not be in a position where you are able to do a summer placement. You might not be able to afford that. And I do think two things that law firms can do to assist with that is along the lines of blind interviews and contextualized recruitment. You know, blind interviews on the lines of making sure that you've removed certain details from a CV. So, you know, perhaps even a name specifically, or perhaps removing the university that the person has come from, the town that they've come from, because all of those things can cause unconscious bias. You know, where I think we've moved along the lines of having certain firms that recruit from certain universities, but there might still be certain biases that are there, and contextualized recruitment along the lines of understanding, you know, why did that person not do as well as they could have done? You know, what economic or social circumstances may have led to them not having the experience that someone else might have, but on the same merit, they can still do the job. So I think definitely having a look at those sort of solutions can assist with progression and access as well.
One of the, we've heard in the profession that law firms and even some universities are using things such as blind applications, blind recruitment, to try and level the playing field, to try and address some unconscious biases that exist. Is anybody aware whether the process for promotion, once you're within a firm, if effectively we forget about that and it comes back to the old tap on the shoulder, or is there different metrics that are used to try and level the playing field in terms of work that the associate, for instance, has undertaken, etc.? Does anybody have insight into how law firms would promote from within?
I think until very recently, and I kind of couldn't speak for all law firms, but I think it has been almost kind of a tap on the shoulder to, you know, it's again the work that you've been able to access, the sponsors that you have within the business as well. I think that's changing, and I think again, you know, always going back to the data point, but I think again, if we're tracking this much more thoroughly, we can actually showcase the CHPD, what the work allocation has been like, you know, all of these things, and actually start to track what demographics are accessing more work, or are there those changes or differences there, and you can't hide behind that. You know, they'll tell you something, and then you kind of need to be able to take that into consideration. And I think again, you know, and it's been mentioned before as well, but around the kind of bias is just reviewing each of those processes that you have and constantly looking at how you can take the bias out. I think unfortunately, as soon as there's a human element involved, bias will be introduced. But if we can make it as much as we possibly can, mitigating those impacts. And I think blind recruitment, for example, can be really effective, but I also think it's almost can be one of those things where, you know, you will still get the problem when the person joins, even if you kind of recruit someone who you don't know where they've come from or what their background is. The person will still have to work in that organization, and if then they're feeling that kind of not belonging, being excluded, you know, they're not going to want to stay. So I think it's almost kind of challenging why we wouldn't be hiring from certain universities, or you know, challenging why grades are now going to tell us exactly how that person will perform in their careers. It's actually having those conversations rather than just eliminating that entirely.
Does anybody else want to come in on that question around how law firms promote from within and what can be done to try and level the playing field?
I could, I guess, talk on behalf of the experience I've had at a couple of firms. Sorry, everything is frozen on my screen, so I'm just going to talk. I would say not quite the sort of tap on the shoulder that Emmi's described there, but there is, I mean, certainly for us, we have a very sort of structured developing leaders type program, but a lot of that is, it's, you know, who's sort of almost a level of self-promotion as well for people to put themselves forward to go on these types of tracks. And I think a big part of it, I would agree with Emmi saying around that sort of internal sponsorship and who's sort of stuck their head above the parapet and gone out and got those sponsors, and very much agree about taking a real good look at all of our internal processes and the transparency around those, and yeah, making sure that those are, you know, starting from the bottom up in terms of recruitment and attraction, but making sure that you're following those through with those, just tracking those processes all the way through, and making sure that you're eliminating bias and barriers all the way through. I think it's certainly getting better in terms of that. But you know, change obviously doesn't kind of happen overnight, and there's so many elements that we need to be looking at and reviewing, and it's where to start. And I think it's just, I think like you said, Usman, it's so important to have these conversations so that we're really hearing where people are coming up against barriers and where people are you know, finding those, and then for us to go away and take a good look at our own firms and what we're doing about that.
And I think Jessica has kind of echoed some of what you said, Emma. She said that law firms should promote awareness. Speaking about diversity and inclusion should not be treated as taboo or a tick box. There should be some internal CPD for staff members, just raising awareness of these issues within law firms. Just that awareness itself will try and maybe focus minds when it comes to recruitment and promotion.
Yeah, absolutely. I would 100% agree with that. And I think it's just something we just didn't talk about much before. But yeah, absolutely raising awareness at all points, and you know, talking about bias and making people think about their own biases and challenging that is so important. And just, yeah, making sure that everyone is aware of the different experiences that people have in the workplace. No matter what those experiences are, you know, they're all shaped by different things. But I just think all those conversations are so helpful.
I'm going to try and finish on two questions. The first question is, what advice would you give to lawyers from an ethnic minority background about how to progress in the profession? I think, for instance, a couple of recent answers have touched upon things like self-promotion, self-branding, but I'll open the floor up to, what advice would you give to somebody that's wanting to get ahead in their career?
I think I would say, you know, don't be afraid to have any uncomfortable conversation about your career progression or professional development. If you feel as though you are at a disadvantage, or if you feel as though those conversations need to be had, yes, it might be a risk versus reward situation, but definitely be bold enough to have that conversation. And I do also think, you know, don't let imposter syndrome win. I think we do all have that, regardless of what stage in our careers that we're at. But I feel like there can be an added layer there. If you are from a marginalized background, or if you're minority ethnic, you might feel like you're other or that you don't fit in. So definitely making sure that you keep that in check and you realize that you are being the best lawyer that you can be.
Any other advice? I
think the point has been touched on quite a lot, but is to kind of reach out from within your own sort of practice area and sort of make a connections in any way that you can, you know, in order to kind of get those types of mentoring and sponsorship relationships going, and participate in, you know, wider firm activities. And yeah, I think, and you know, I think we've touched on a few of the other things already, but certainly building those relationships and yeah, putting yourself forward and having a plan would certainly be kind of my advice.
I think I would agree with that. The point about having a plan, at least anecdotally speaking to lots of ethnic minority lawyers whom I work with SEMLA, most don't seem to know where they want to go in the profession. Whereas I think sometimes you'll see people who are very driven in that they know where they want to go, and just having that plan itself helps focus each of the different things that you need to be doing to progressing within the profession and within the organization. I'm going to end on a question I think Maria has asked, but I was intending to end on this question too. Maria said, I wonder if there is any meaningful discussion around positive action measures to address underrepresentation, or is that just deemed too radical? And I was intending on ending on this question, which was, is positive discrimination or positive action the best way to achieve better representation of ethnic minorities in the legal profession in Scotland? Who wants to come in on that radical question? Tatura?
You couldn't let that just live in peace as friends, could you? I think there's a place for it. I genuinely do, and it's the way we think of positive discrimination. It gets a lot of bad press. It's probably misunderstood more than it is understood. So what we are already thinking about is putting people from ethnic minority backgrounds in a better position, consciously, than their non-ethnic minority background people. So perhaps you have two candidates identical in grades or whatever, simply preferring one because they are an ethnic minority. Now, there's nothing wrong with that legally. I'm very happy to say, but the point is, what is right with it? What is right with it is, if you're trying to meet a genuine and sort of positive objective, it's a good thing to do. And all the things we've discussed here today are about trying to, one, rectify something that's institutionally wrong, two, give young solicitors or incoming students, etc., some hope that actually this profession is changing, give them the encouragement, let them see things changing. So being willing to go out on a limb and say, here's something that I haven't tried before. Here's an ethnic minority candidate. I only have one or none in my firm. I want to make this difference. I want to increase my diversity. It's a good thing to do. It's a positive thing to do. It's it's in the genuine public interest. And it goes to what's been said just now. We have to do things that haven't been done before. We have to challenge the status quo in a sense, and the same goes for employers. They have to challenge their own status quo to say, we literally would have done the opposite thing yesterday. Let's do something different from what we did yesterday, because otherwise nothing is going to change. Instituting targets, whether it's literally hiring targets or progression targets, can be really useful. Just tie it into good data, tie it into other structures, make sure people are being mentored, not just throwing people in and then, as Emmi said, leaving them lost and having nowhere to call home. But yes, I think positive action, let's call it, is a good thing.
Does anybody want to come in on that positive action question before we conclude?
I would like to, echo what Tatura said. Yes, definitely. If it is going to ensure equity when it comes to access and progression, then there should, if you've not tried it before, perhaps it's something that you should take on board. And in a perfect world, there would be no reliance on it. It would just be instead based on merit, irrespective of, you know, your ethnicity or your background.
And just to conclude, I think you mentioned merits, and one of the things I find really interesting is in New Zealand, for instance, when they're recruiting judges, they've expanded the definition of merit. So the criteria for merit includes the ability to, I think it includes the ability to contribute to the diversity of the judiciary or making it representative of society. So it's the ability to add to diversity within an organization or within a firm is seen as part of the criteria that people are scored on. And I've always thought that's a very nice way and a proper way of doing so, because if we all agree that diversity is a positive objective, then why shouldn't that be factored in? Gillian has written some advice, which I would could only echo. To remember that pretty much everyone feels like an imposter at some stage if they are honest. Just don't be fooled by those who seem to be sorted. And that's absolutely my experiences in the profession too. Don't be fooled. Almost everyone suffers from imposter syndrome at some point or another. With that being said, I want to thank all of the panelists for what's been a really enlightening, interesting discussion that we've had, and thank everyone who has watched but also contributed. We seem to have quite an interesting, free-flowing discussion. So thank you everybody for joining. Should I pass over to somebody from the SYLA to say conclude the event?
Thank you, Usman. So yeah, before we bring the event to a close, on behalf of Scottish Young Lawyers Association as well, we'd like to thank Usman and our panellists, and of course our very engaged audience for taking part in such a thought-provoking discussion. As a follow-up to the roundtables, we'll be publishing 2 blogs providing a brief summary of the key takeaway points from each roundtable. And as I said at the beginning, the recording of this evening's event and the Access Roundtable will be available on our website. And in January, I think it will be, we'll be hosting a coffee with the committee session with Amina and Brianella. And this is a very informal drop-in session that they will host, where members are invited to join us and share their views in a very informal, light setting on this vitally important topic. So thank you so much and have a good evening.